Welcome back. Dr. Milo Wolf here, not actually a real wolf. And today we're reviewing AlphaDestiny, aka now Alex Leonidas's training advice. Full disclosure, I used to watch a lot of Alex's content back in the day when I was starting out in sports science. Since then, however, I haven't been keeping up to date very much, but I have had the pleasure of interacting with him on a podcast debate with the one and only natural hypertrophy. And so I have both some familiarity with Alex's content from back in the day, and I'm on good terms with Alex. However, I wanted to take one of his videos, one of his more popular videos on lateral raises not being that effective, and review it from a sports science perspective. Indeed, my PhD is on range of motion and muscle hypertrophy, and so I think I'm qualified to have an opinion when it comes to sports science. Join me as I react to this video. Let's get into it.
Most of my workout videos, I always get the same question. Alex, how come we never seen you do lateral raises yet your shoulders are so round and huge? Isn't isolating the side delts mandatory for acquiring that 3D pop? Well, before we dive into this topic, know that if you do care about maximizing shoulder width, then obviously including some form of lateral raise is optimal. And even I did them for years to build a base, and stopped at the end of 2016 where I peaked at 85 pounds on the power version. Definitely bad form, but the body English did a good job of balancing out the strength curve since we're weakest in the short position where most attention is present.
Real quick, I want to point out that one, his technique really wasn't very good. I agree with Alex. But two, I love that he used a disclaimer at the start saying, hey, if you want to optimize shoulder growth, there's a very good chance that you should be doing lateral raises. So I love the disclaimers here, and he's already more nuanced than a lot of people in the industry, in my view.
For the textbook version, I use a good 30 to 35 pounds for moderate repetition. So wasn't weak and can admit that my side delts did respond very well. So then, why did I completely drop this effective exercise shortly after? I can't remember all the exact reasons, but the main one is that I was scared of potentially having shoulder problems since I was constantly maxing out on rather sketchy presses while mixing in higher volumes. So I temporarily swapped out all lateral work in favor of posterior. And the primary exercise I did was the band face pull, along basics like reverse flies, reverse pec deck, variations of cable face pulls, etc. Now, here's where things get interesting. Not only did my side delts not shrink, they actually got bigger. And I didn't notice any slowdown of progress. So I just kept at it for months, which eventually turned into years. And OGs will recall this face pull phase. And one day, I woke up and realized that I didn't need lateral raises. The face pulls were a 2-in-1 banger, indirectly growing my side delts in the shortened position.
A few things here. One, no single exercise is required for hypertrophy. So even if you're not doing lateral raises, you can probably still see a good deal of side delt hypertrophy, right? Through upright rows, through overhead pressing, and indeed, as he's mentioning here, even through face pulls, depending on how you perform them. For example, if you set up the cable below shoulder height, kind of below you a little bit, you can turn a face pull into a face pull upright row hybrid, and the function of the side delts will still be involved within that movement. Likewise, when you're overhead pressing, you are actually involving your side delts to a decent extent in all likelihood. And so, if you're doing enough of these two exercises, for example, you might just still see some robust side delt hypertrophy in spite of not doing any lateral raises. With that being said, Alex did mention that face pulls, and he's doing them with bands here, did grow his side delts in the shortened position. I know Alex isn't exactly a sports science YouTuber, right, which is not to his discredit, but I do think that that's probably not true. Indeed, the evidence we have on lengthened training versus shortened training generally shows more hypertrophy when training in that lengthened position. And so that's why categorically, I wouldn't really recommend using bands for hypertrophy. And I have a whole video on that here if you want to check it out. Bands always make the lengthened position easier and the shortened position harder. And so if you're after more tension and stimulus in that stretch position of an exercise, bands directly counteract that.
Some subscribers were sending me EMG data from Brett Contreras, which confirmed my anecdotal experience. Specifically, band face pulls beat lateral raises. And every rear delt exercise demonstrated a decent amount of side delt activation, a splashover effect.
Funnily enough, around the time I was watching a lot of Alex's content when I was around 17 years old, is also around the time I read the same article that he's referring to here by Brett Contreras on T-Nation, where essentially Brett went out of his way to measure the EMG, or surface electromyography, of a variety of muscle groups during a variety of exercises to get an idea of what exercises might be best for muscle growth for different muscles. The issue with this is that surface EMG, or muscle activation as measured through this method, is not a reliable predictor of what exercises are better than others for hypertrophy. And there's a whole line of research on this topic suggesting that, hey, you really don't want to be using EMG as a predictor for this exercise is better than this one. It is not a valid reason for the time being. Indeed, a study by Plotkin and colleagues, for example, measured EMG of different muscle groups during the squat and hip thrust before starting the training study. After this, they had participants perform either exclusively the squat or the hip thrust, and they wanted to see whether the activation measured before the study in different muscle groups like the glutes, hamstrings, adductors, and quads in different regions of each muscle would then correlate or relate to the muscle growth seen from these different exercises across the training intervention. To make a long story short, there was no such trend. And so EMG really can't be used as a good predictor of what exercise targets which areas or which muscle groups more effectively.
Brett was surprised with the takeaways, but I wasn't. Now, besides results, this shift in focus taught me another crucial lesson, and that is the rear delts are incredibly important for rounding off the shoulders. Many lifters don't know this, but you can actually see them from a front view. With enough muscle, when you're flexing or leaning forward, the effect is extremely apparent. Then from the side profile, the front and rear delt contribute together for the outward extremity width. So really, the side delts primarily impact broadness protrusion from the front view and cap separation between the arms along other heads of the delts. But keep in mind, they're 1/3 of the delts and generally most stubborn, which explains why a huge percentage of naturals will still have overall impressive development without necessarily having the biggest side delts. In addition, understand that the shoulder is the largest muscle in the upper body, and since front delts get abused in all our presses and have the highest growth potential, that's obviously what matters most for growth. The rear and side finish off the sculpting, but between those two, the rear should technically be easier to build, which I'll get into. Plus, there's always indirect side delt stimulation, so let's talk more about rear delts. In my case, I just mentioned isolation work, which was very helpful, but the truth is, that's not the main thing that blew mine up. In reality, it was unintentionally doing rows with improper form for years. See, I'm a huge fan of performing opposite movement patterns for structural integrity and preventing muscular imbalances. In the case of the back, I was focusing on bench press specialization and therefore always use a rowing technique that matched the arm angles of my pressing, which is tucked at around 45 degrees. That's the best way for optimal leverages and safety. Of course, that's exactly what I replicated on rows.
A few things here. Yes, rows are a decent tool for growing the side delts, especially with your elbows out. That's why something like the cable rear delt crossover, as I pointed out in my shoulder growth video here, is a great exercise for rear delt growth. However, it is not the best exercise, and more importantly, I want to point out the sort of slight bro science here on trying to superset always opposing motions for joint or structure integrity. The truth is, there's just not much evidence on this when it comes to trained lifters. You don't need to be performing one set of pulling for every set of pushing you do. There's just no evidence to this. So just because you're benching a lot doesn't mean you also need to do a lot of rowing work to balance it out.
At the time, I thought this was more upper back, since the bro science consensus was that flared arms equated to more rear delts. So it also fit in nicely to my yoke philosophy. Now, the thing is, as biomechanics has expanded, it turns out that this reasoning was backwards. In truth, the rear delt fibers run at a 45-degree angle and are biased the most from this exact style of row. Basically, flared arms equals more rhomboids and traps, fully tucked in a neutral position is lats, and right in between is rear delts. And you can even feel it if you try it yourself. So, as you can imagine, doing a rear delt bias row for years resulted in pretty good development. And this further indicates that they're a strong muscle with tremendous growth capacity. So this accident has led me to conclude something that minimalists were low-key right about. Getting strong at presses plus specific rows equals enormous shoulders. It's literally that simple. And when I look at history, particularly among the old school natural bodybuilding legends, pretty much all of them did the same thing. In fact, I recently learned that the one and only Reg Park was frequently asked the same question as me on how his shoulders were so big despite not emphasizing lateral raises. And guess what? His response was practically identical. He built his shoulders through traditional pressing and pulling, combined with the chest expander, which works the entire shoulder complex. Oh, and I can tell you that my delts were sore as hell the first time I used mine.
Real quick to touch on the whole chest expander thing, I think it suffers the same limitations as using bands within your training does. And that is that it always makes the lengthened position more easy and the shortened position more challenging. And so for the most hypertrophy possible, and we're talking about a difference of maybe 10 to 20% here, from going from a movement that's entirely focused on a shortened position to a movement that's entirely focused on a lengthened position. So yes, you can still make gains with bands or with this apparatus here, but if you want to optimize hypertrophy, it would be inaccurate to say that this device would do that.
It's true that he also included cheat lateral raises, but those were never the main focus. And I've done those too in the past, as I talked about earlier. And even when I reread books like Dinosaur Training, all the names mentioned acquire both the shoulders by running the same methods, just getting big and strong at the compound movements. So many were weighing under 200 pounds, yet overhead pressing in the 200s. What does that say? And now that you know this information, who are you going to listen to moving forward?
The issue with taking advice from someone who has just built an impressive physique and claims that it was due to X reason or Y aspect of their training or nutrition or what have you, or supplementation even, is that there are so many confounders and that we're talking about a sample size of one here, that it becomes difficult to tell, okay, was it the fact that this man didn't do many lateral raises? Or was it the fact that this man had great structure for having wide shoulders, right? You can't really tell. And so taking a more anecdotal approach to deciding which exercises or which interventions broadly lead to more muscle growth just lacks the rigor of something like a study, where you take a few dozen of participants, control for as many other variables that could be contributing noise that you can, and have multiple studies on the same topic, and once you find an overall trend, you can be more confident in a finding, as opposed to just going to the most jacked individual in your gym, or the most jacked individual 50 years ago, and just replicating what they do instead. There are so many confounders and so much noise involved that are often more influential than what they're talking about, that it becomes difficult to tell, was that really the deciding factor here, or was it the fact you have great genetics, great sleep, great nutrition, and so forth?
Real naturals who paved the way that unquestionably works, or juice heads who are literally preaching the complete opposite philosophy. Also, consider that the shoulders respond best to anabolics given the androgen receptor sensitivity, and it makes sense why, for some reason, the best naturals of all time can't match the side delts of many modern moderate users. Is it because they required wisdom from the Death Star delts? Absolutely not. They're just built different. One is hypogonadal, the other isn't. So the only advice that's genuinely helpful is, what are the best compounds and how much should be taken? But seriously, many rambling aside, just look at me. I'm not a freak of nature and my shoulders used to be way smaller, but now they're quite dominant. I think that says a lot considering I'm one of the few naturals on this platform who significantly improve without doing lateral raises, yet my delts can hang with the top dogs. It's to the point where I wouldn't be surprised if people started calling me a liar, claiming that what I did is impossible or that lateral raises must have been done off camera, and then they point to a little B-roll clip that's not actual training footage. Listen, I got nothing to gain by being transparent like this because this is the long and hard way. Plus, I already said that you should do lateral raises if you care about optimal development.
The issue with AlphaDestiny claiming that his example really contributes to the evidence that you don't need lateral raises for really solid shoulder growth, not optimal, as he claimed, and I appreciate the disclaimer, is that there's a lot of things that he probably changed over the past 2 years. If you look at his overall training, it got substantially more effective, right? His training back in the day had some effective components, like for example, he was getting a good stretch on most exercises, but there were a lot of ineffective components as well. Moreover, when you're assessing whether or not his shoulders have grown, he's actually always had a pretty good physique, at least for the past 5 years or so. He's definitely improved, but whether or not the improvement is attributable to the lack of lateral raises and focusing on other movements instead is unclear. And then there's also the issue of measurement, right? He is showing pictures from back in the day versus now, but those pictures do not have the same lighting. They don't have the same posing. Hell, they don't have the same body fat percentage. There are a lot of confounders here in how he's even assessing whether or not his shoulders have gotten bigger that are difficult to remedy and to really determine whether the lack of lateral raises and focus on other movements made a difference. But I agree with Alex that he now has great shoulders. I can't deny that.
That said, one thing I want to point out is that even though isolation work is extremely important, so include at least one exercise for the side and rear, I still believe that presses will work your side delts to a certain extent. I fully reject the claim that there's zero stimulation. It's certainly less than isolating, and some presses work them less than others. But if trained correctly for long enough, the absolute loads will lead to indirect growth.
There's a few things here. One, I do agree with Alex, the overhead press does train the side delts, and I've made a whole short about this here, and you can check that out. The reason why it does train the side delts to some extent, and a decent extent, let's say, is because one, it does somewhat target one of the functions of the side delt, which is to abduct the arm outwards, and two, because it does have the side delts relatively close to failure, right? While there are other muscle groups that will likely give out a little bit earlier, like the front delts or the triceps, the side delts will still be reasonably close to failure. So while they won't be the limiting factor, they'll be close to being the limiting factor. For these reasons, I think the overhead press is a decent exercise for the side delts. However, it has nothing to do with the weight on the bar, ultimately. Your muscle does not sense how much weight is on the bar or how heavy the dumbbells you lift are. It senses tension, how much tension it's producing to lift the weight, and how much tension it's experiencing while it's being lengthened, for example, through passive tension. This tension is ultimately what leads to growth. However, this tension is not the weight you lift on the bar. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're doing lateral raises with your arms very bent like this. You could use a good amount of weight, right? And that would lead to a certain amount of tension being experienced by your side delts. However, let's say you took that same weight, but instead performed lateral raises with straight arms. The tension experience of the side delts, even though the weight is the same, would be substantially different. And that is the case for most exercises. Most exercises have differences in external and internal leverages. And so just on account of the difference in external leverage or moment arms experienced at the shoulder during something like an overhead press versus a lateral raise means you'll be able to use substantially different weights. But that doesn't mean that there's a substantial difference in the amount of tension being experienced at the side delt level, and thus the amount of growth being incurred.
You can't tell me that only the front delts will grow from taking one's overhead press from 135 to 225, or a 50-pound dumbbell press to 100 pounds. Even the data indicates clear activation, and I greatly appreciate Jeff Nippard mentioning this fact in his science-based full body workout.
This isn't an opinion that I personally share. First of all, even though the front delts will be carrying most of the load, it isn't like the lateral and rear heads just completely turn off and go to sleep while vertical pressing. Just look at this figure from Saderbacken and colleagues. In the standing barbell press, even though the front delts were the most active, you're still seeing significant activation of the side delts and some activation of the rear delts as well.
As Jeff Nippard correctly points out in the caption in this clip, there is an issue with using EMG as a predictor of hypertrophy. I outlined it earlier in the video, but you don't want to be using EMG as the be-all end-all when it comes to saying, yes, this exercise is good for hypertrophy for this muscle group because we see a high EMG value.
This kind of reminds me of those who talk trash about low bar squats for quad development. Even though there's minimal knee flexion and it's the least quad biased version, the fact remains. Serious lifters build tree trunks from low bar due to the heavier weights used. The consequence is a worse SFR ratio, but that doesn't change hypertrophy outcomes.
Oh man. So the low bar squat absolutely targets your quads. However, it has nothing to do with the weight on the bar. Once again, in the low bar squat, you're actually reducing the moment arm involved for the knees, right? The distance between the weight or the center of mass and the joint, the axis of rotation in this case being the knees, reduces. So while you can use more weight, it's unclear how the moment arms and the tension being experienced by your quads and the growth you get as a result is changed. So it has nothing to do with the weight on the bar. Additionally, Alex then goes on to say that SFR is worse, but that doesn't impact muscle growth. That is kind of just untrue, right? Because if we assume that someone has enough time at their disposal to train to the maximum ability and really to challenge their recovery limits, we want to maximize how much stimulus they get versus how much fatigue they get. Because let's say you can recover from 100 units of fatigue. That's the maximum you can train. You want to, across your training week, accrue as much stimulus for those 100 units of fatigue as you can. Because ultimately, that stimulus is what causes muscle growth. So if we can get 200 units of stimulus versus 100 for the same amount of fatigue, that will lead to more growth. In fact, arguably twice the growth in this very hypothetical thought experiment. If SFR doesn't matter for hypertrophy, you could say, okay, I'm gonna run for hypertrophy now. Just go for jogs, no more lifting. And running has an SFR for hypertrophy, right? It gives you some stimulus for hypertrophy, but it gives you a lot more fatigue. And so by the time that you're all spent and you can't recover from any more training, you won't actually have gotten that much stimulus for hypertrophy. And so you'll have missed out on much growth across your training week. So SFR absolutely matters for hypertrophy if you have the time to train to your recovery limits. As a final note on SFR, it is worth noting that it's highly hypothetical, right? We have some idea of which exercises produce more stimulus based on, for example, whether they put your muscle in a lengthened position, whether there's tension in a lengthened position, and so forth. We have some idea of what exercise is more fatiguing, based, for example, on how many joints are involved, how much of an eccentric component there is, and so forth. However, a lot of it is speculative. But to claim that this speculative notion is unimportant for hypertrophy is wrong.
Getting strong overcomes a lot of faults from specific exercises.
That's the video. I just reacted to Alex Leonidas' take on lateral raises and why he stopped doing them for shoulder growth. Overall, I would give this video like a 6 or a 7 out of 10. I think there's some good takes in there, like for example the idea that overhead pressing does actually train the side delts reasonably effectively, and that you can make great side delt growth gains without doing lateral raises, but that ultimately you need lateral raises to optimize hypertrophy. I think that's all valid. However, when it comes to some finer points like equating load on the bar with stimulus or tension at the muscle level, and with EMG being a valid predictor of hypertrophy, I do disagree, and that's where I think I take issue. However, by and large, I think Alex provides some pretty practical information for the average lifter. And so, a 6 or 7 out of 10 is where my final score is. That's the video. If you enjoyed the video, please comment, like, subscribe, leave a comment if there's anyone else you want to see me react to from a sports science perspective, and I'll see you guys, my favorite people on the whole planet, in that next one. Peace.